The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of IRONCLAD, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Went and met the leader of the Gulf Cartel, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén. So they were part of the federal police. They were doing anti-narcotics operations, but then they met the members of the drug trafficking organizations, in this particular case, a Gulf Cartel, and they started to work for the leader of the Gulf Cartel as his Praetorian guard. Then they were sent to Nuevo Laredo, which is kind of the main point where drugs are at that time were, sent to the United States because of the importance of its customs, because of the importance, and this is the place where more vehicles cross every day along the whole U.S.-Mexico border. And they were sent them to protect the plaza, to protect the territory from the incursion of other groups, particularly the Sinaloa cartel. So that is the official story of the origins of Los Zetas.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. My conversation today is with Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera. She is currently a professor at George Mason University and an expert in immigration studies, U.S.-Mexico relations, border studies, and international security. She enlightened me on how we label the cartel and how we are not giving a full, vision on the truth of the business aspect of the criminal organizations. It's a viewpoint that I've never heard before, and I'm excited to share with you. So here it is. If you don't mind, would you be able to kind of introduce yourself with a quick bio for the audience?
Yes, my name is Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera. I'm a professor at the Schar School of Polity and Government at George Mason University. My areas of expertise are organized crime overall, border security, U.S.-Mexico border security, U.S.-Mexico relations, U.S.-Mexico border relations, Mexican politics, and of course, immigration, in particular, the areas of human smuggling and trafficking of migrants.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's definitely this subject has become so interesting to me, and the more I get to interview people like you, I just learn so much more. You know, what stands out to me the most is the Los Zetas, right? The Los Zetas Inc., your book. You know, when I first got into the Border Patrol, I was a Border Patrol agent from 2009 to 2015, and I spent most of those years with special operations as a medic for BORTAC. And you know, one of the big concerns early on in my career was the talks about, Los Zetas. And even more interesting enough, before that, I was special operations in the military. And so, I guess rumors when I got out was that they were trained by ex-special forces, Mexican military, and then kind of slowly became the Zetas or something like that. Would you mind clarifying that more for me, for the origins of Los Zetas and kind of what it is today?
Absolutely. The origins of Los Zetas, effectively, that's correct. Former special forces of the Mexican army. Sometime during the training period in the United States, I have not been able to confirm that training of the original Zetas, but they started to operate in Mexico, the Mexico South, particularly in the state of Chiapas, and they were training counterinsurgency operations and counterinsurgency tactics to deal with what at that time was considered a national security risk, the Zapatista movement. So after that, they were extremely well trained, and they formed part of the U.S. Federal Police, and they were some of them were sent to different parts, the former special forces of the Mexican army that operated in Chiapas, and the original Zetas went to Tamaulipas, to the city of Matamoros. This is where Arturo Guzmán de Sena went and met the leader of the Gulf Cartel, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén. So they were part of the federal police. They were doing anti-narcotics operations, but then they met the members of the drug trafficking organizations, in this particular case, a Gulf Cartel, and they started to work for the leader of the Gulf Cartel as his Praetorian guard. Then they were sent to Nuevo Laredo, which is kind of the main point where drugs are at that time were, sent to the United States because of the importance of its customs, because of the importance, and this is the place where more vehicles cross every day along the whole U.S.-Mexico border, and they were sent them to protect the plaza, to protect the territory from the incursion of other groups, particularly the Sinaloa cartel. So that is the official story of the origins of Los Zetas as an organization dedicated to different things, because they started working for the Gulf Cartel. The Gulf Cartel was a drug trafficking organization exclusively, but they changed the face of organized crime in Mexico and other regions of the Americas, because they started to diversify their activities because of the military training, the military capacities, and the idea to control territories, and all the illicit and all the illicit and some licit activities that are performed in the territories that they control. And they started to extort and commit extortion, kidnap people, extract rents from the people. That's the interesting part. And they started to dedicate themselves to human smuggling and to other activities like fuel theft, and particularly extracting rents from the people. And now we don't have Los Zetas as a regional organization and as an organization that operates regionally, but we have cells, and they exported that model to other groups of organized crime, including the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and the Sinaloa Cartel, because they took this capacity or these strategies to diversify their activities, and this is a model. Los Zetas, in the book that I write, I'm not writing about the organization. I'm really writing about the model.
So if you could please clarify for me personally, the Los Zetas were originally created as almost a security force to protect the cartel as they smuggle drugs and making sure that they have kind of an easier pathway with no issues. And then went from there to eventually becoming more powerful, and also did they become almost a form of a cartel, or did they kind of become their own entity working alone?
That's very important, because they worked for Ociel Cárdenas Guillén as enforcers, and of course they went to Nuevo Laredo to protect that plaza, but then they grew there. It's kind of like their birthplace, even though they met Ociel Cárdenas Guillén Matamoros. But in Nuevo Laredo, this is where they grew, and they started to come up with their model, controlling territories with their military capacity, and started to extract rents from different illicit businesses that were operating in that territory. They started to become more needed, and they started to expand the operations. When Ociel Cárdenas Guillén was arrested in Mexico in 2003, they continued working with the Sinaloa cartel until the year 2007, when Ociel Cárdenas Guillén was extradited to the United States. And this is where they started to work independently to some extent, with less, surveillance, of course, continue working with the Gulf cartel, but they were able to control more and more territories. And now they so-call themselves, with the Gulf cartel, La Compañía, the company, because they kind of became relatively independent, but they continued working together when Ociel Cárdenas Guillén was extradited to the United States. However, exactly the year when you arrived to the Border Patrol, the year 2009, there was a big confrontation. And in the year 2010, they entered into actively a so-called war between the two groups, because both of them have acquired military capacities and a lot of arms, and the military strategies that, of course, Los Zetas brought to the whole organization of the Gulf cartel. So you had two armed groups confronting themselves. And after that, because the president of Mexico at that time had declared a war on drugs by the year 2006, you had another level of conflict. You had the armed forces going and heading, and facing these two groups. So the violence that was generated in the state of Tamaulipas and what you saw, the beheadings and extortion, had a lot to do also with the involvement of the Mexican military, because they needed some cash to fight that war against the military and the other group. The other group, I'm talking about Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel. But Los Zetas brought that model. That's the model. It's not the group, it's the model. And in reality, what happened when they started to confront with the Gulf Cartel is that they were basically a group of enforcers, a group that perpetrated criminal activities through fear. And they wanted also to become involved in drug trafficking. But it has never been so clear that they dominated the main routes to traffic drugs to the United States. They were part of the business, but we don't know exactly to what extent. Today, we have criminal cells that perform, that extract rents, become involved in human smuggling, in trafficking in persons, in fuel theft, but they are not necessarily connected to drug trafficking. And this is where a lot of experts or journalists that are talking about cartels connect everything that happens in Mexico or all sorts of violence in Mexico with drug trafficking, which is inaccurate. Because usually the drug trafficking business, as you might very well know, requires some type of silence, some type of you don't have to call the police or call attention or hit the plaza, calentar la plaza. You don't do that.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you say it's kind of the business model. I can't put together what it's similar to originally in my head. So here in the United States, they have like the Brinks security trucks who pick up the cash from the banks and deliver them to, the bigger holding of the cash. And so they're like the security force for the bank. But what Los Zetas kind of were like the strong arm of the cartel to help them facilitate movement and make sure the product gets to where it needs to go. And then eventually kind of gained more power. I guess the cartels would say, man, this works really well. Let's give them more. And eventually turns into a model that, you say the violence, from when the cartel was there and the Zetas were having issues back in 2010 is when we were seeing on the border and on the news and journalists some very, very aggressive versions of deaths. Like you said, beheadings. I'm talking people were found in vats of acid. You would find whole houses. I'm talking multiple people beheaded because of their, turning their backs on the cartel or whatever it may be. Even it might be a rival cartel because fighting over territories. But it was so violent at the time that it was, pretty reminiscent of some of the stuff we've seen overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, what ISIS would do, what the Taliban would do. And it seemed at some point during the 2015 era, there was a competition between almost the terrorist organizations overseas and the cartel and who can do the most traumatic type events to kind of cause fear in the organization, but no fear in the countries. It's like they were gaining ground and gaining dominance by fear, like you were saying originally. And the Zetas, for a long time, for us, boots on ground working, was a very intimidating force that we weren't sure what that looked like. You hear people are military trained, and then you see who gets captured. They don't look military-esque in saying fitness-wise, body aesthetics. Someone who's in special forces in the army, in the military, is usually very good shape and kind of presents a certain way. And the Zetas, some did present in a way you're like, that's definitely a military special operations guy. But as the years passed, I felt that when Zetas were getting either killed or the security forces are getting into altercations and guys were getting arrested, that started to change as well. And that's just an assumption of my own that I've said to others, that I'm curious to see what it looks like now compared to what the original state of what the Zetas were. When they were very strong, they were very well known, and they were a threat to all of us. I'm curious to see what that looks like now. Are the Zetas still a force in Mexico and are involved in the drug trade, or has the kind of model kind of soaked into all the cartels and they all have some kind of fighting force that defends them now?
Well, we need to explain this more carefully, because the criminal world in Mexico is extremely complex.
Yes.
And unfortunately, in the United States, the agencies and the media refer to what happens in Mexico, or the violence that we observe at the border and different regions of the country perpetrated by criminal paramilitary groups, because they have this military strategy background, some of them. And you're correct when you said some of them were in good shape, or maybe trained, have access and knew how to deal with this equipment and knew how to deal with this strategy. There were some influences of other special forces like Los Caiviles in Guatemala. And this is something interesting, because the origins of Los Zetas, we have talked about them, but their capacity and the involvement of other groups like even Maras and Caiviles that were, reported at some point, had an influence on the model itself. However, it's very important to know that also the utilization of the word cartel is very generalized, and we can talk, and this is important about the book. I'm not talking about a group. I'm talking about a model that has an origin on this group. When we talk about cartel, the word cartel, it's not about drugs, and people connect cartel, the phrase cartel or the concept of cartel with drugs, because this is how the media refers to. Everybody refers to drug trafficking organizations. A cartel is an illegal poly. Big Pharma is the biggest drug cartel in the world. And these groups fight among themselves. What happens in an oligopoly, in a cartel, a real cartel, they get together, they sit together, they negotiate, and they decide how much of the product they're going to produce in order to get, acting like a monopoly, in order to get the high levels of income with that negotiation. Cartels don't do that, or drug cartels. They fight among themselves. And this is why we talk about cartel wars. So the word starts and we generalizing this idea. Let's say, okay, cartel is a drug trafficking organization. But generalizing this idea is wrong, because the Los Zetas brought a model that cannot be explained in the traditional framework of the traditional cartels, which is an organization that has a leadership and operates with through the orders of this leader or leaders. That didn't happen even in the years 2010, 2015, because we had Zetas in Coahuila, we had Zetas in Veracruz, we had Zetas in Campeche, and it seemed like a franchise model where Los Zetas took, different people or different members incorporated themselves, for example, in Monterrey, with the gangs that operated in certain parts of the city of Monterrey and the state of Nuevo León. In other parts, they were taxi drivers that were connected with the local police. It's very complex. And here, the way that the media presented is like, okay, these cartels. No, we can talk about a criminal franchise, as journalist Ricardo Ravelo wrote about Los Zetas. Sometimes they, copied a model, and they perpetrate, some actions, create fear. But this is where we cannot just talk about terrorism. Terrorism is internal terrorism, terror perpetrated by these groups in the country, in Mexico, against Mexicans, because in certain places, these cells are just extracting rents from the Mexican people. And they kill and they kidnap and they commit extortion against the Mexican people, usually micro and small businesses. This is how they get their money, but they don't deal with drugs. So in that regard, what we are observing is terror in Mexico that has to do with investigations of the Mexican government, not foreign terrorist groups. And it's important to understand that drug trafficking organizations are specializing in sending drugs to the United States, Why perpetrating fear and why hitting the plazas? It doesn't make sense to me from a business perspective. And this is why we have to understand this as a business, from a business perspective, and stop generalizing and make this more complex. We have cells that have been, this fragmentation took place because of the involvement of the Mexican government and the Mexican armed forces that divided these groups, and these groups started to specialize. You cannot do everything. Maybe Los Zetas started doing a lot of things at the same time in the city of Nuevo Laredo. This is what you saw in 2010, 2012. But now we see groups that just kidnap, and they say, I'm Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. I follow the orders of El Mencho. They even don't know the Mencho. Maybe El Mencho's dead, and I'm sure that he's very weakened because he had a dialysis because he had a disease, and he was going to, even supposedly, he constructed a hospital. How is he going to deal with operations all along the country? We're talking about a criminal franchise, and we are not necessarily talking about drug trafficking. This is something that we need to understand really well in order to stop defining or trying to define or trying to come up with strategies that are not going to end the violence in Mexico or drug trafficking, if this is what we want to deal with. It's very, very important what I'm saying here.
Thank you, Warner Brothers, for sponsoring this video. If I had a time machine, I would definitely want to go back in time to the Wild West. But after watching this movie, you realize real fast how dangerous it was.
No.
I love this movie because it had love and romance.
And here you are.
But also death.
What you build, they will burn down.
It had some historical events that happened, trying to take over the West and find what's home.
You and I are standing guard on one of the last great open spaces.
And at the same time, you have people that are conflicted about what is theirs and who owns what first.
I will take from you until you are wiped clean from this land.
Yeah, the West was a wild one for sure.
What do you want to say?
You guys go check it out and you'll love it. Yeah, no, it's way more complex than I ever gave credit for, and I appreciate enlightening me on that. And now I do understand what you're saying is that this is more than what we all focus on is just this drug trafficking, right? We've put it all into one lane and saying this is what they do, but it's more than that. It's corporations, it's business. It sounds very similar to what the Italian mafia did years ago, where they became legitimate. They bought hotels, they bought casinos, and they kind of grew into this and almost phased out of the I guess, criminal organization and turned more legit. So generations later, they just financially have the capabilities of owning businesses, and it's almost like washed out and disappeared. And then the low-level people continue to do the criminal stuff. It almost sounds like what we are naming them cartels is just the tip of the iceberg of what really happens in Mexico. Is that correct?
Yes, but at the same time, this involvement in other businesses still, that idea that has been framed by the media and by the reports of the law enforcement agencies, and I'm talking about not only Mexico, not only the United States, but also Mexican journalism, with that idea like narcos and cartels, and then this has been also fed up by, the images in Hollywood and Netflix and Telemundo, right? El Chapo, Los Narcos, and whatever. And we need to be serious and rigorous when analyzing this. Yes, they have big capacity to exercise, to commit extortion and all these crimes because of impunity, because of corruption. But we need to analyze all the criminal activities separately. For example, 2024, the campaign elections in Mexico, they called this as and this is true. I'm not saying that there's no business, there's no violence in Mexico. Denying that would be abhorrent because, there is violence in Mexico and very high levels of violence. And the assassinations, 190,000, over 190,000 people will be killed in Mexico during this sexennium. It's an enormous figure, less than the deaths because of overdose of drugs in the United States in the past 3 years. Over 100,000 people have died. And this is a different phenomenon. Also, we have to understand it's connected to some extent to some of the groups that operate in Mexico and are doing illicit businesses. But a lot of what we see, the high levels, the high impact crimes in Mexico are perpetrated by criminal paramilitary groups, not always connected to drug trafficking. And when we see the violence against local politicians, the local candidates of different political parties, and they were saying the cartels, well, organized crime of different types. Each of these assassinations needs to be investigated because sometimes we're talking about criminal entrepreneurs that participate in illicit and illicit activities, and they want someone that will allow them to continue growing and continue not paying taxes or continue doing what they want to do at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. So we saw a lot of assassinations of candidates at the local level that have to do, these assassinations, possibly with local dynamics that are not connected to drugs. So ascribing political power to cartels is an idea of Netflix. This is much more complex, but it's true. The violence is true. The assassinations are there. The impunity and the corruption, both sides of the border, when we talk about the entrance of drugs in the United States and its distribution in the United States. So we need to study these and analyze this in parts.
So it's almost like all the violence that happens in Mexico needs to be compartmentalized and then really evaluated on who's creating this kind of chaos and why. And so someone like a political leader who gets killed might not, and people want to blame immediately the cartel. Well, there can be another political person that gains ground by assisting in this assassination.
Exactly. That's correct. That's correct. Assisting. And sometimes we don't, like, for example, there are a lot of kidnappings of migrants in southern Mexico. And some of the migrants that have been kidnapped and have reported the kidnapping, and we have talked to them, they say, okay, I was kidnapped by the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And I was like, really? It's great to use that brand in order to say, so talk to your family and in Central America or wherever, in South America or wherever in the world, and then give me the money for the ransom, or the payment of ransom, or your family in the United States. So that's why this is a criminal franchise, as Ricardo Ravelo says. So yes, sometimes they help drug traffickers, sometimes they work and enforce drug trafficking organizations to cross the border. But at the same time, we are not just talking about that. We're talking about entrepreneurs that commit their own crimes and, do their own criminal business or illicit businesses.
This is, a lot of the questions I have here, are really framed towards the cartel. And now that the conversation, I think I can frame it slightly different. So you see what happens with, everything that happens in Mexico. How does, the country kind of gain control so that there isn't criminal organizations, there isn't, entrepreneur criminal activities happening? Like how does that change, or is it something that doesn't? I think America had its own set of issues on its own as well that might kind of mirror the same thing when you look at it the right way, when you don't look at it as if looking for the bad guy in the room. There's corruption in business here, there's corruptions in taxes, there's corruptions in many different facets. Several of the whistleblowers from Boeing mysteriously died. That's weird, right? And so those kind of things make me think like, man, is this part of the same kind of idea? And so in Mexico, and you've studied it so well, what are some areas that can be addressed to kind of slow this, this bleed, or kind of help, create a country that is thriving again?
This is a very important question, and it's kind of like it has a lot of areas and dimensions that we need to address or look at in order to come up with a possible solution, or at least directions for solutions. The problem of violence in Mexico is explained by many forces, but it's based on very high levels of impunity and corruption and the involvement of government authorities at all levels. There are some organizations and the dynamics that these criminal activities or illicit activities conducted by these organizations are connected with transnational exchanges. And when we talk about arms trafficking, money laundering, and drug trafficking, we cannot just say, yeah, the corrupt Mexicans or the corrupt U.S. authorities on the U.S. side of the border. We have to deal this in collaboration with intelligence. And, there have been many reports that have provided good solutions, like the bicentennial framework that nobody cares about. But it's a commitment, it's a compromise among these two governments, Mexico and the United States. Canada agrees on that framework too, that has to do with, dealing with this in different areas. One is enforcement, what is prevention, protection of people, involvement of the civil society, and addressing the root causes in the United States of drug consumption. Not everything is about drugs.
I highly appreciate the fact that you giving us this perspective that no one's addressed yet, because I would continue to go down the road of just highlighting only cartels or only drugs. And with this conversation, it actually makes me take a step back and say, what am I missing? Or how did I get sucked into the same idea? Because there's so much more. We do in America focus on the drug issue because we are currently going through an epidemic of losing a lot of people through drugs. And a majority of those drugs are coming from the southern border. So yes, I understand why we have a heavy focus in this and why we point fingers and blame directly to the cartel, because, it's who we see as the bad guy in the room. Not saying they're not. I'm just saying that's who we have identified as the issue. And sometimes we don't identify why does America have the biggest consumption of drugs, right? We don't identify it's supply and demand. And so we've created the business that is thriving right now because of our own issues of consumption of drugs. I would love to better understand this broader idea of what's happening in Mexico and not so much this linear thought of just cartel. Let's focus on them.
Right. I just wanted to, these are two questions, and I just wanted to tell you that when in the United States people ask about cartels, usually people in the United States is concerned about the fentanyl crisis, is concerned about the opioid epidemic, is concerned about the very big amount of people. Big numbers of deaths because of overdose of drugs. I'm conducting research in Kensington in Philadelphia and Skid Row in Los Angeles to kind of explain better what is happening in the United States and what is connected and what is not connected with the drug trafficking organizations. I have found many other responses to what we are observing in the United States, both in terms of production, manufacturing of fentanyl and synthetic drugs. That's one. The second is the dynamics of that's why we don't have cartels in the US, even though the price goes up very, very quickly. But we're talking about synthetic drugs and a free market in certain spaces, open air drug markets. And we have, people can consume whatever drugs they want. And drugs are distributed in the United States. You can have whatever you want. And there are dealers that, start their relationship with the consumers in the morning with the police present by saying, free samples. That happens in the United States in places like Camden, like Skid Row, like Kensington in Philadelphia. I've been there a number of times, and I'm doing research with the NGOs, with communities that live there, that work there. And this is what I have been understanding.
I also want to talk about the new president, because I know the president before was kind of no bullets but hugs or something, hugs not bullets or something like that was one of their mottos. And, the new president that was elected, I believe it was yesterday, I remember reading up that she has very similar political views as the last president. And, is that going to hopefully make better impacts and strides towards, making Mexico a more safer environment, maybe addressing some of this, drug trafficking areas, but also some of the infrastructure stuff that we talked about, some of the entrepreneurial areas of concern, of corruption. In your opinion, is she someone who is going to make strides in a better direction, or does it just seem that it might be the same?
Claudia Sheinbaum is she was to some extent the selected one. Supposedly, members of Morena through surveys, and no, not only members of Morena, but that survey was that poll was done generally, right? And she was the one chosen by the people. But basically, the current president still is very popular, and she was a chosen one to some extent. I don't want to say that, but I mean, you utilize that word because it also is being used inappropriately in other ways to say that she doesn't have any thoughts by herself. However, and she's a strong woman, she's well prepared, she has a PhD, she's a climate scientist, all those things that also the media talk about. Education is not, or having a PhD does not make better politicians or leaders or political leaders. But she's been effective. She was the chief of government of Mexico City. She relatively did well managing the health crisis in 2020 beyond. And she's been effective. And you could see her, the way that she present herself, the discourse and all that. The biggest issue in Andrés Manuel López Obrador government was the security issue. But that being said, I have been criticizing the way that this is being described, not by you, by the media in particular, and by the series of Hollywood and also the political commentators that talk about this issue. But the reality is that we have a very, very difficult situation in that regard. And in this administration, the 190,000 and more, maybe, close to 200,000 at the end of this year, probably. We're gonna have, this sexennial, the total number of homicides are much bigger, that this is much bigger than the past two administrations separately, right? And Claudia Sheinbaum has promised to build the second floor of the fourth transformation. Mexico's government is called itself, Andrés Manuel López Obrador called itself the government of the fourth transformation, connected with the foundation of the Morena Party that has advanced a lot of, spaces in even achieved. Let's wait for the final results of a supermajority in Congress. So they're going to have a lot of power. She promises to build the second floor, and with regards to security, she was relatively successful dealing with crime in Mexico City because the homicide rate decreased significantly, as well as the numbers of crimes of different. The different types of crimes. So she's trying to say, this is why I can do this, and I'm going to utilize some of my expertise there to address the issue of Mexico. But she is basically maintaining the military industry and militarization. There's going to be a consolidation of the militarization at the institutional level because they're going to be able to put the National Guard under the Secretary of Defense. And she's with the militarization. She's not going to build police, basically. She's just going to move in the direction that was laid out by Mexico's president. But she's been saying that she's going to do the same thing she did in Mexico City, which is coordinating the the general prosecutor's office and the police. Well, she don't have police, but she's going to have the National Guard. It's very different what she had to deal with in Mexico City. We're talking about mafias that are not transnational criminal organizations or criminal paramilitary groups that I'm talking about, that you have seen and you know how they operate. The beheadings, the massive levels of violence, the generation of fear, the extortion. It's very different. The criminal organizations or the mafias in Mexico City work as well, and they can be controlled by also government mafias at the local level. That happens in Mexico. So I don't believe that she has, I don't see a credible strategy that will move forward, because I see the same people, in charge. And I see the same strategy and with a lack of understanding that what you dealt with in Mexico City is super different from what happens in Guanajuato, in Sonora, in Zacatecas. How are you going to do this? And you don't have people who know about this by your side. So I'm concerned about that, but I'm not as concerned as others in the US because they connect all with the fentanyl crisis.
You know, what we've seen in the past 4 years on the American side is just a massive influx of immigration. And with that massive influx of immigration, you have drugs, you have potential terrorists, you have who knows who's coming through the border. Obviously, our policies as a country need to be adjusted, need to be fixed. We're almost incentivizing this action, but on the Mexican side, our partners on the border don't seem to be wanting to slow it down either. And so I understand there's a business that happens. I understand there's multiple layers of that business, whether it be from drugs, whether it be just almost transportation, whether it be a million different ways you can kind of write that up. Speaking with other individuals, they don't see there being an issue as being almost the travel agency that assists in people's efforts, and so it's going to be very hard to change that. And if this new president has the same, I guess, people in her, in her administration, well, then I don't know if there's going to be any change on the Mexican side. And so for us, we have a potential. How long are those? How long does that president stay in office?
6 years, but let me tell you something which gives me a little bit of hope. One of the main limitations that the past presidents had to solve or at least to improve the situation of security in the country has had to do with the lack of cooperation between the federal and state levels of government. In this case, Claudia Sheinbaum is going to have, because of the triumph, the landslide, of the Morena party, not just for the presidency, she's going to be able to collaborate very closely with a lot of governors and a number of local authorities too. So the discipline that the party has right now, and the discipline that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's way more charismatic than Claudia Sheinbaum, he could have done this much better if he had a chance of 6 years. But she's very effective. She's pretty tough and pretty effective. And also, she's not as radical as Andrés Manuel. She is very pragmatic, and she has incorporated a number of actors of different political forces into Morena. And she said that in the first address that she gave to the people when she was, when the results were favorable for her. And I don't know, that gives me hope. The concentration of power, and concentration of power is not at the end of democracy, but might be, yes, limiting democracy or the end of democracy. But that does not talk about a weak or failing state. On the contrary, we're talking about a non-democratic regime, a failing state. It is a completely different thing. A regime and the state and the capacity of the state and the strength or not of the state is a completely different thing. David Frum talked about, wrote an article that made me like, what is happening here? That guy needs probably a basic course, a refreshing course on states. But he wrote the discourses of George W. Bush. Now I don't understand why. Is this failing or weak? I don't think so. And the thing in Mexico, what has happened, or what Andrés Manuel López Obrador was able to do, was something I never imagined. I'm very critical of all political forces, but I was like, wow, he was able, that these majorities would support his fourth transformation project as limited and as ineffective in key areas as it is. But weak, I am not sure about that. It's complicated. The security situation is very complicated, and it can lead us to think that the state is failing. However, there is, a light at the end of the tunnel. And if Sheinbaum is able to understand what she has to do, and she's going to have an advantage that her predecessors didn't have. which is the possibility of leading a national strategy.
Where are you currently residing in? Do you reside in the United States?
I reside in Washington, D.C., but now I'm in Mexico City. I traveled very, very, very frequently to Mexico City, and my research is done in the field of Mexico. So when I talk about the Mexican criminal world, I am talking about work that I have been doing on the ground, interviewing people and traveling to places. This is why sometimes there is a failure of some of the reporters in the United States to kind of depict the reality, because some of them don't even speak Spanish well, and they hire their fixers, and they kind of like go there for 3 days or something like that. So I'm Mexican. I was born and raised in Mexico. I'm Mexican and I'm American, naturalized American citizen. So I have the two perspectives, the perspective from the US side of the border and the Mexican perspective.
Awesome. I love it. Well, we're running down to an hour. I'm curious, is there some last thoughts you'd like to tell the audience for them to maybe clarify, or anything else that you might have missed that you want to mention?
I would like to mention something that it's important that I have been learning when I have been doing research in Kensington, in Philadelphia. It's important to kind of understand the dynamics that have led to the fentanyl crisis in the United States. And there is a question that I have. I cannot answer it. According to the numbers, according to what the U.S. agencies, law enforcement agencies, the story about the precursors coming from China and the drugs being manufactured in Mexico and then sent to the U.S. For me, from an economic perspective, this is not based on evidence. I don't have that evidence, but it's kind of hypothesis that I would like to lay out. The pharmaceutical companies, the U.S. pharmaceutical companies, are extremely powerful. It's very weird. It's very strange that the precursors for fentanyl are only produced in China. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's probably a hypothesis of conspiracy, but it's a question, and I think it's valid. When you talk about businesses, illicit businesses, they want to lower their costs, right? It's like normal. It's the logic of the market. So why would you manufacture synthetic drugs in Mexico and bring the precursor from China? If you could have the precursors in your country, and I think the story is that the precursors are not produced in the US. But what about the labs? Synthetic drugs are easy to produce. Why would you produce them in Mexico when you could produce them in, let's say, Utah, or you can produce them in Wisconsin? You can produce it in, their spaces are open. Of course, you're not going to produce them in New York City, or you're not going to produce them in Los Angeles, right? But it's interesting. There's a question about that, and the dynamics that I have observed in open air drug markets need to be further evaluated. What we are observing with the NGOs and harm reduction strategies that bring more people to open our drug markets. This is what when we can explain about consumption patterns.
This subject is like opened my eyes. I didn't think about it in the way you presented it, and which has me, I'm going to be doing a lot more research, a lot more looking into this. I really do love the way you've kind of flipped it on its head for me. And I can understand now how I missed it. I can definitely. Would you like to talk about a little bit before we close it out, the book you have coming out again about Frontera, a journey across the U.S.-Mexico border?
It's a book that was published by an academic press, Texas Christian University Press, that as I said, has 420 photographs of the trips that I have done with my best friend and almost brother, Sergio Chapa. And we wanted to show people that the border is beautiful, that the border, it was already published. It's beautiful. I would love you to buy the book. I can sign it. We're gonna be doing where do you live?
I live in Dallas, Texas.
Yes. So we're gonna invite you because we're gonna do a book launch in Fort Worth.
I would love to go.
Yeah. I'll let you know. I'll write Jessica, and I'll let you know when we're gonna do that. But because for sure, this is our house, right? Our home.
Yeah.
We will do that there.
Awesome. I'm excited to check that out. Honestly, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for opening us up to a whole different perspective and look at what happens in Mexico. There's so much to dig into that I'm excited to. Now I have to go read your other book as well about Los Zetas, and to learn more about the kind of the structure that you wrote about. And so thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I had a good time.
Thank you, Vince. It was a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you today.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to Borderland, an Ironclad original. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe everywhere you get your podcasts, and on YouTube at This Is Ironclad.